Thank you. And some of you, I think, have prided yourself away from cottages on the chain and to come and find out a little bit about the history, and I appreciate that. I also appreciate that my good friend Keith Proust from Chain of Lakes Marine sponsored the event this evening. And if you don't know, the Clearwater Harbor Barn Grill and Taylor Lake Marine are all on the same property there, the former Edmonds Boat arrangement that they had over there. And so Keith has pontoon boats. If you are interested in going around the chain and looking at some of these historic sites in person, that's a good place to start out. In fact, I used to, when I was a captain out there on the Chief Waupaca, I would tell people as we pulled away from the dock that we were actually viewing the most historic site on the chain that they were already at when they were standing in line to get on, because that is really the initial access point where people from the city of Waupaca would get to the chain. It's the closest point really to the city of Waupaca, and that's where a lot of the early action, and continuing today, the action on the chain is right there. So I put together this pocket guide last year after I had done this book 4 or 5 years ago. So in both cases, the form that I used to organize the material was to, and by the way, is the volume okay? Usually people say I'm speaking too loudly, so I can certainly crank it up a little bit if we need to. But the way I organized the material in here was basically the way it was organized if you were going around the chain and looking at things, because that's the way I was doing it when I was giving tours, and the way a lot of people do. And then this one that I did a very brief kind of abridged version is actually meant to be taken out on a boat, and there's a map in here that shows the various points and matches up to the information that's in the booklet, and you can kind of follow along. But for tonight, when the discussion was the early history of tourism, I thought I would deviate from that approach of just going around the chain, because that kind of mixes periods in there. So you have some things that are like ancient Indian type considerations, and then you have some fairly modern post-war history, and then you have some 30s and 40s history as you go through the historic sites in general. So I wanted to focus on the Victorian era on the chain to do tonight's presentation. And so it's going to be a little bit of a deviation from this. Well, we've done in the past, we've done boat tours around for the Historical Society. We'll probably do that again sometime so that you can follow along on one of those. But for tonight, it's Victorian America. American Victorian period is a little different than the British Victorian period. Victorian really means the reign of Queen Victoria. But in America, we generally regard it as post-Civil War to about the beginning of World War II. So we're talking, in my case tonight, 1870 to 1914 is the Victorian era. And that's when we know that's when tourism started out here, as the first resort hotels and the first tours and the first sense of vacationing. And I wanted to see what really was behind that. I'd read that that it was mostly a function of the fact that people suddenly had leisure time. And that wasn't entirely persuasive to me. There is some of that in that we were moving away from quite such an agrarian society into a little more urban society. And so there were hours, and you didn't have to be working kind of constantly as a farmer would be. But I thought that there must be something more to why tourism took off in the Victorian period. So I wanted to first of all get a little context of what Victorian period really was, and we just lost the picture. Oh. But as I started it in 1870, the concept is the reason I picked that is because 1870 or 1871 is when the first tour was given on the chain of lakes, and it's when the railroad first started having service to the Waupaca area. But in 1871, Waupaca was near the edge of the civilized world. It's hard to imagine this, but at the time, over 80% of the land in Wisconsin was wilderness as a practical matter. There weren't roads to it. It was wild, and just 25 years or so earlier, it had actually been Indian country, and so any white people who were here at that time were essentially guests, subject to essentially tribal law at the time. So I have a picture of the original survey that was of Waupaca back when it was called the Falls of Waupaca or Waupaca Falls. The original settlers arrived in 1849. We had the government survey here in 1851, but the whole state wasn't surveyed until the end of 1866. So we're talking about a time period when the Indian Wars were still raging out west. Populations here, the logging boom had just begun. It wouldn't hit peak until 1892, the whole lumberjack era. So 1870 is really a different world than what it's like now. We kind of tend to think that they just wore different clothes, but they were a lot like us. But really, culture was very, very different. As I had in the last paragraph, to the extent Wisconsin dairy products could find a market at all, its butter was sold by the barrel in Chicago for use as axle grease. I mean, we were not the dairy state at that time, although we were moving for some good reasons towards that. By the way, the format that we have here, when I do a presentation, I try to pack it into a book format so that I can use it as a chapter of a book at some point in the future. So this is essentially a right page of the book, and now we're going to go into spreads as we go forward. So this will be a familiar looking kind of a thing with a funny gutter down the middle. So 1871, there were no automobiles, no refrigerators, no telephones, televisions. It'd be another decade before a single home in the world had electric lights. And one of the first was Hearthstone in Appleton, if you've ever been there. That's worth the visit too. Indoor plumbing existed, but it was a rarity. And basically, people used outhouses and chamber pots at the time. Drinking water came right from natural rivers, lakes, shallow wells sometimes. I mean, at the Veterans Home in King, which was sort of the later Victorian period, they drew the water right out of Rainbow Lake for many, many decades there. They filtered it, but it basically came right out of the lake. Local transportation, wagon or carriage on dirt roads, long distance travel was mostly accomplished by boat and stagecoach for areas that weren't served by rail. And so rail was the new thing. It came into its own to some extent during the Civil War period. If I recall my dates right, it was after 1871 that the Transcontinental Railroad finally matched up the Promontory Point things. Do you remember in your 1869? Okay, so we're right at the time point of the Transcontinental Railroad here in 1871. So steam-powered ships and locomotives were the pinnacle of transportation, and 1871 was when tracks first reached Waupaca, or rail service actually first reached Waupaca, and it was also the first year that a passenger boat offered tours around the chain of lakes. And so I regard those as the initial, the beginning of the tourism industry for this essentially frontier town. So that's kind of the look at their. We think of them as being a lot like us, but just wearing these long dresses and kind of funny clothes. But really, it was a very different time. Mark Twain sarcastically referred to the last 30 years of the 19th century as America's Gilded Age. I think you've probably heard that. It wasn't a compliment. It was actually a criticism of the time, that everything was just a thin veneer of good covering up kind of a lot of problems a little ways beneath the surface. It was the age of robber barons and mass immigration and bold adventurers and cultural turmoil. So it's when tourism, or travel for pleasure is kind of the definition that I'm using of tourism, first took hold. And so the factors that I've been able to identify as the considerations that gave rise to this is, first, the growth of cities due to industrialization. The availability of rail transportation played a huge part in it, because it was possible to have relatively comfortable long-distance travel off of a steamship. Before that, there were very comfortable steamships, but if you weren't in that kind of an environment, it was pretty rough going. Mass European immigration to America, mass American migration to the West, increased prosperity due to innovation. I mean, there are a lot of new things. We think of ourselves as being in an environment where new is going on. Well, back then, there was that same sense of innovation and technological improvement was felt. And of course, the Civil War had been such an unpleasant thing that once you got over the war, if you weren't down in the South where everything was burned and destroyed, if you were in the North, you wanted to have that feeling of being able to get back to normality. But I regard the emergence of accessible visual media as a factor that hasn't been heavily discussed, but I think was particularly important in this entire process. If you've seen any of the newspapers of the day, they're kind of, we think of them as kind of funny looking now. They're basically sheets of gray because there weren't images in there to any extent. What images that did occasionally make it into newspapers had to be done through an engraving, so they had to have either a woodcut or a steel engraving that was used to make up a printing plate. And so generally it was all gray type on those pages, and until you can get to a point where you have some sort of a inspiring visual media, you don't, I feel, build up the urge to travel the same way as seeing things that are available. So I'm going to try to follow along as I read this, and also don't follow along as I read it. So a popular Victorian phrase in the Victorian vernacular was to see the elephant. And has anybody heard that phrase before? So at the time, the elephant, in the phrase of going to see the elephant, is metaphorical. It stood for anything unusual or spectacular that you just had to see. And so it kind of is a reference to circus elephants that were the biggest draw, and they were the animal put at the head of the parade when the circus came to town. And if you were going to go see something, you wanted to go see the elephant. But Niagara Falls, as I have the picture here, would be one such metaphorical elephant. It was something that was worth the expense and inconvenience of travel just to see and experience in person. And that's what the visual media was able to provide, was a sense that reading a story about how spectacular Niagara Falls just doesn't do the same thing as seeing a picture of it, particularly a picture in color. Okay. And so, as I say, it says as much about Victorians as it says about elephants. The men and women of this chaotic age viewed the world around them and all of its changes as a circus. So they kind of saw the world that they were living in as a circus. And there was constantly kind of a circus coming to town. There were new things, new inventions happening, and so people wanted to be able to travel to see it. And it's also important to note that life up until the 1970s was pretty much pure drudgery. You had freedom, you had democracy, but you had to work like a dog all summer just to survive through the winter. And so the fact that there were now places to go, things to see, things to do, was really a big change from the America that we had to live in before that. So the public's thirst to learn about interesting things brought 10 million visitors to the U.S. Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. And to get a sense of that technological prowess that they were showing off, I mean, the entire population of the U.S. was about 44 million, and they had 10 million visitors there. That building, the giant glass main building, was dismantled in 1881, 5 years later, but while it stood, it was the largest building in the world. So they had that capacity to make the largest building in the world just for a show, just to show that they could do that. And 2 decades later, Chicago was the site of the great Columbian Exposition that attracted 27 million visitors over 6 months in 1893. And by that time, the population, just 20 years later, was up to 65 million. So we had a lot of new people coming. The Columbian Exhibition, shown up in the top right print there, was sometimes called the White City. It was a miraculous display. They took essentially a swamp and turned it into the Venice of the Midwest for that exhibition. All of these last 3 pictures and this one down here are, of course, by Currier and Ives, if you didn't recognize them as such. And they were the self-described publishers of cheap and popular prints. And I think it's difficult to overstate how much their printing business did for the tourism business. It was the fact that they got these kinds of images into the hands of the average man just kind of opened their eyes and whetted their appetite for this sort of thing. Now, they did start a little bit before America's Victorian age, but basically their period of Currier and Ives operation was 1854 to 1912. So that's pretty close to the time period that we're talking about. By the way, that's also kind of the time period that we at the Historical Society are dealing with, because we've got a building here that you're in that's 1913, 1914 is when this building was constructed, so that's late Victorian. The Hutchinson House is 1854. That's slightly pre-Victorian. It's British Victorian, but it's not so much American, but it was occupied and used during the Victorian period. And of course, the depot is also a late Victorian. It's 1908. Yeah, that it opened. So all of our buildings you can get a sense of what Victorian America was like. So the idyllic imagery of Currier and Ives, as I say, worked like a travel poster depicting not only great places, but other people who were enjoying their visits. You know, all of these images have lots of people in it. And as I say, today we call it FOMO, but the fear of missing out was a big consideration for Victorians as at the beginning of the age of tourism as well. So, speaking of the Columbian Exhibition, we have here wanting to feel like part of the action is exactly why Columbia Lake here on the chain of lakes was originally called Columbian Lake. Back in 1871, when the first tour boat left at Clearwater, what is today Clearwater Harbor, the string of lakes we now call the chain stopped at Indian Crossing. So the Indian Crossing channel at that point was shallow and narrow, and you had to get out and drag a boat through at that point. And so it wasn't until 1893 or 94 that the channel was dredged and that a new bridge was put in. So this was the original bridge, and that also came a number of years after 1850, but that was the first bridge that went across Indian Channel, and then this is the bridge after the dredging in 1894, and so that opened up the lower chain to development, and one of those developments was Columbian Park, and this is that point as you go out from Columbia Lake into Long Lake. You go through that little narrow channel there, and that's the area where that subdivision was. And so it was, the Columbian Exhibition was the big news item in that time, and they tried to mirror that or capitalize on that by naming the lake. And the lake prior to that had been known as Round Lake. This is so we had in this map, we have the chain of lakes is all on the north side of Indian Crossing, which is here, and then it was Round Lake and Big Lake. Of course, this was Clear Lake or Twin Lakes over here, and then the little chain is all over there. So the chain developed as tourism developed, and the early chain was very much focused around Rainbow Lake. That's where the major developments were. It was close to the road coming by here, the road between Waupaca and rural, and so that's the main activity in Sunset Lake, and which was called Hicks Lake back then, and Rainbow Lake in the Victorian period. The new Columbian Park and the raised bridge also opened Columbian Lake to another big development, Camp Cleghorn. Victorian vocabulary was different, so the concept of the term camp back then wasn't what we think of as a camp these days, as kind of a summer camp, but a camp back in the period was very typically used to refer to a resort type area. And camp kind of came from the Adirondacks at the time. In the Adirondacks, a lot of the early resort summer home developments were referred to as camps, and in fact still are today. And it was in the Adirondacks that they developed the terminology for retreating to such a location for vacation or leisure. It was called rusticating. So you can put that into when you go to your vacation home, you're planning to go rusticating. And then another 19th century term that's etched into Chain Lake's history is casino. Obviously, these days, casino tends to mean a gambling parlor, but casino in the Victorian era, while it was literally an Italian word meaning gathering place, was a kind of a dance hall amusement park center. So every resort area had a structure that they tended to call a casino. So it's a rarity here on the chain now, because most of those places have changed, if they exist at all, have changed to some sort of a different vocabulary to describe the kind of building that they have. But it has always been a place where concerts, dances, and group entertainments were held. And of course, the reason that it fell out of favor for that use is because Italy was part of the Axis in World War II. So after World War II, people did not want to use an endearing kind of Italian term for something, and so they stopped calling places casinos in general. And another word that you don't hear very often is Chautauqua. Are any of you familiar with the concept of the Chautauqua? Teddy Roosevelt said that the Chautauquas were the most American thing about America. And it was back in the pre-radio days. They were primarily tent shows. And it was a summer entertainment and adult education experience. And they started in New York, upper New York State, at the Chautauqua Institute on Chautauqua Lake. And it is still a thriving institution and attraction in upper New York State now. We have one in Bayfield, if you've ever been up to Big Chautauqua up there, and there's a permanent facility in Boulder, Colorado. That's a Colorado Chautauqua. We even have one in Amherst. There's a little group that operates the Tomorrow River Chautauqua out there, so they have programming that you might want to follow along at some point around here. So Camp Cleghorn, which was founded in 1897, was one of these facilities that was kind of a summer education and training facility. It wasn't a revival type religious organization. It was more of a fraternal organization, and its mission was temperance, peace, brotherhood. It was kind of trying to teach people to be better people, and that's what Chautauquas were like too. So it didn't take long that Cleghorn became a regular stop on the summer Chautauqua tour. So the same speakers would tend to kind of whistle stop around the Midwest and go to one of these presentations or another one. So the Good Templars was the organization behind Camp Cleghorn, but the Methodists, Quakers, Lutherans all had different camps. In fact, there was a Methodist camp on the north side of Taylor Lake, right opposite the lake from where Clearwater Harbor is today. So there was a great urge for people to get out to clean water, clean air, and so they capitalized on this as being an environment that would be a suitable place to conduct these sorts of meetings. So beginning in 1899, visitors to Camp Cleghorn and the Chautauquas were able to get there by first taking a train into the depot in Waupaca, and then getting on a trolley that would take them out to the chain of lakes. Basically, the end of the line was just after the Veterans Home and just before the hotel, and beneath that was a dock that was run by Dan Downey, and it was known as the Electric Dock. And it's characteristic of the time period. You can actually still see some of the posts and things in the water down there in that little bay from the Electric Dock. But why it was called the electric dock, an unusual term for us today, because we know that electricity and water don't mix that well. But at the time, the fact that there was electricity down by the water, and that this facility in the evenings was illuminated brightly by electric lights, whereas the others were illuminated by oil lamps and open torches, it developed that name. And electric lighting was the main feature of that 1893 Columbian Exposition. That they illuminated the entire, they had a central power station and illuminated that whole white city, and that was kind of the first time that America saw electric lighting as more than just a curiosity in a very isolated context. And so just 9 years later, there is electric power out to the chain from a power plant down in Waupaca, then run out, and the electric power that ran out to the chain, to the Grandview Hotel and to the Veterans Home, also powered the trolley line and then provided power out to those facilities. So this is the Veterans Home as it looked in 1893. So the Veterans Home story, I think I have on the next page. So the Veterans Home was built on the site of the first resort that was opened on the chain of lakes. So the first resort was the Greenway Park Hotel, and it is featured in this colorized version of a railroad poster, and it was located pretty close to the site where the Marden Recreation Center is. If you're familiar at all with the Veterans Home, that's the building that's right down on the water where they do the water ski shows, so the hotel started out there in 1881, and this poster was from 1885, which was the year that the hotel failed. So the tourism was still kind of a sketchy business all the way to the mid 1880s. So even though there was train service to town, it still took some effort to get out. This was before the trolley was built, and you had to take a horse-drawn carriage to get from downtown Waupaca to get out to that. So they weren't able to make it go as a hotel, and they then, well, it stood vacant for a couple of years, and then the state of Wisconsin, well, not really the state of Wisconsin at that point, it was the Grand Army of the Republic, was looking for a place, searching central Wisconsin for a location for an old soldier's home, and the city of Waupaca actually bought the old hotel and donated it to the Grand Army of the Republic to use to build the Veterans Home. It started out as just the hotel and 80 acres, and eventually it has expanded to more than 300 acres. And part of that expansion took place in 1941 when the state of Wisconsin paid $10,000 to buy the old Grandview Hotel. And so the Grandview Hotel, if you're looking at it in this picture, this is the point where you start going into Nestling Lake. So you're just kind of rounding the bend and going into Nestling Lake here. This corner back here would be Downey's Dock or the electric dock, and then the Veterans Home would be over in that direction. The Grandview, when it was opened that was 1894 was the first year that they had resort operations there, was the biggest and the best of the hotels in ever built around the chain of lakes. And this is a little bit of a floor plan for it. There was the main hotel, and then there was an annex built to it. There was a dance hall over here. The kitchen was separate over here for the housekeeping. Then they had 10 well, I guess that's maybe 8 cottages around there too. So you could either rent the cottage by the summer, or you could stay in the hotels. And this is the picture of the main hotel at the Grandview. So there it is, 1894. The Grandview was built, and everybody, as what I have in there, the photos are a little bit misleading because the limitations of photo technology required such a long exposure. I know you guys, everybody has, even the movies these days have kind of jokes about everybody was such a sourpuss back in the Victorian age because they all have that stone-faced look, and that was because of the photography at the time that required such long exposure. So if you had to sit still for 5 minutes, or five minutes, for 5 seconds up to 30 seconds to get your picture taken, you did it in kind of a resting face, because if you smiled and then you let your smile drop, then your mouth just looked like a bunch of mush in the photograph. So it was not a good result if you didn't stay still. And so while all these people are looking very stoic and sedentary in the pictures, in actuality they were kind of wild and crazy people. And one of the examples of that is that at the Grandview, they had one of these summertime toboggan devices, and there's one at Coney Island up in the upper right-hand corner, and this one's from a place in Ohio, which is pretty close to the same kind of thing that was built right into the hillside out at the Grandview. So you would go up a set of steps, and then you'd get to the top, and this is 2 people coming down in a little cart, basically a flat bottom toboggan, and then these are all wooden spindles that rotate, and so you'd go up, and then it would flatten out here, and it would shoot you like couple 100 feet skimming out across the water into the thing. So you'd shoot down and then fire out like that. And so that's what they're doing in this one, is firing out into the water. So if you've ever been on that on the boat tour out there, as they go past the old Grandview site, they say there's one set of stairs. If you look just right through the trees, there's a set of stairs. Well, those are actually the concrete steps that they used in connection with that toboggan operation when they had that going. And so, like I said, that's the picture in Coney Island. The other one is Chester Park in Ohio, and they were both taken around 1905. And by that time, the shutters and things had developed a little bit. Much of the credit for the technology of improving photography and for using photography to promote tourism goes to Wisconsin's own H.H. Bennett. If you've been up to the Wisconsin Dells, you may have seen the State Historical Society's site where they opened up his old studio and explained a lot about that. And this, of course, is his most famous shot, and this was in 1886. So this is pretty early days. This is Bennett's son Ashley jumping the 5-foot gap between the main bluff and Stand Rock up there. And so it took 17 shots and 17 photographs in order to get the one that he thought was a proper exposure. But right now, you can hit your burst operation on your iPhone, and it'll take 17 shots in less than 17 seconds. But back then, taking multiple photographs, the state-of-the-art process was called wet collodion, and you started out with a large piece of glass. And the first thing you had to do when you were going to take a picture, you had to clean the glass very carefully. Then you had to coat it in this sticky, flammable syrup that you had made before you came out, and it didn't last very long, so you had to pretty much make it that morning. You'd make that, you'd put it on there, and then you'd put it wet into the camera. I think we can go on to the next one. And so you put it wet into the camera, and you had to expose it all with it. You had to expose the image. You had to prepare the glass plate. You had to expose the image. Then you had to develop the image all within 10 minutes. And so if you were a landscape photographer instead of a portrait photographer like Bennett was, that meant that you had to bring along a portable darkroom. And this is a picture of his boat with a little portable darkroom in the back of it. Sometimes they carry them on wagons, but you had to go through this whole process of developing it and fixing it, and then getting a slide ready for the next one. They didn't have photo enlargers, so everything was a contact print. You could only print the same size as the negative. So if you wanted a bigger picture, you had to have a bigger piece of glass, and a smaller picture, a smaller piece of glass to do these things. So they would tend to make a lot of different impressions of the same thing. Now, the good thing about this compared to tin types and things like that was you exposed it onto the tin type, and that was it. That one exposure you made in that one tin type was all you could do. But once he finally got the shot that he liked, he could reproduce them, and that's what he did with a lot of these items. In the upper left-hand corner there is a slide for a stereoscope, and that was, again, along with Currier and Ives, the stereoscope was probably the biggest promotion of tourism for that Victorian age, because what they would do is this is a woman. I don't know if you can see this picture in this context very well, but she is sitting in her lovely Victorian home. This is a cabinet full of slides like that she has acquired. We have some of these at the Hutchinson House, so you can actually go in and look through one of these if you're there. And so she's looking into this, and she's getting a 3D image of what it is, because the two sides are just slightly out of, well, I don't know, they're not out of focus. They're just slightly adjusted left to right, so that it creates in the stereoscope a 3D effect. And so you had people like Bennett who were willing to push the technology and go to great effort to push the technology to get these sorts of dramatic pictures. And it was really a challenge back then to get something, this one in particular. You've got illumination inside here. This would normally be dark, and then you've got the part back there, you've got water. To keep a tonal variation, be able to get the contrast in early photography was really quite remarkable, and he's regarded as one of the top 10 landscape photographers of all time, just because he had such a challenge to work with. But as I say, the development of photography at this time, and particularly the development of stereoscope photography, did an enormous amount for the tourist industry. And so we finally get to like the early 1900s, and you can get people who are smiling. This is a picture of people in the late Victorian era smiling. So it's just to show that they were capable of doing that. And that's Waupaca's own Bluegill Club. They had the little crescent island that's sometimes called Esther Williams Island, or it was called Club Island back in their day, and that was their kind of clubhouse out on the chain. So that's really my conclusion on the chain. But if we flip on to the next one, what I've done is the Victorian Adirondacks, and photography varied so much depending where you were on how good the photographer was, and how good he was at making chemicals, how good he was at developing the plates and exposing them. Bennett went through all the exposures had to be done by sunlight. That was, remember there was no electric lighting, so they didn't have a little photo printing thing. So he developed actually a processing room that rotated so that he could use the sun all during the day. It followed the sun through the sky so he could develop prints. But the whole process was very much, as I say in the top paragraph there, back then it was called making a photo instead of taking a photo. So there was a lot of work that went into getting an image. But the best photographers tended to be out on the East Coast, and so these are some pictures of the Adirondacks, which was a vacation area that was very active in the Victorian period. And so you've got dirt roads, you've got lots of horse-drawn equipment back then. This one was taken in the 1900s, so it does have electric power lines running through it. But again, here in the Broadway, this is in Saranac, New York. Dirt roads, the sidewalks are wooden sidewalks, kind of like you see in the old Western shows on TV. And it was the age of steam and hay. So if you had any kind of power, it was steam power, which meant that people were, like if you were taking a tour boat around the chain, you were sitting on a boat with a boiler that was under high pressure and built by somebody you didn't know who they were. And so you had an open fire and you had the high pressure boiler on there, and a lot of those things would explode. As never happened on the chain. There was one fire that got away on a boat called the Catamaran, and fortunately when that boat sunk, they were only in about 3 feet of water, and so people were able to jump in and not survive. So there was no loss of life in that, but there was one fire on a boat on the chain back in the Victorian times. And so the color picture here is from Detroit Photographic, which is another one of the main players in getting imagery out to the population, and they have a process that is way too complicated to go into. But in the lithographs that Currier and Ives are doing, the photos, the images were hand printed, so everything came off as a black and white lithograph, and then he had an assembly line, or Currier and Ives had an assembly line of people who basically had a color to paint on each one of those lithographs, and they would paint and pass it on, and the next person with that color would paint their section of it and pass it on. And so those were done with there was no color film back when Detroit Photographic was doing these in the early 1900s, but they did have a photographic process that was where they were able to introduce color to the images. And then this one is just another one of the resorts. They would build these giant places. Of course, they didn't have indoor plumbing. They didn't have to worry about electricity. They didn't have to worry about plumbing. So you could build a big hotel pretty fast back in those days. And then they built a kitchen in a separate place because the kitchens burned down much more frequently than the hotels. In fact, the kitchens always burned down. It was, if you kept the kitchen going for a few years, you had accomplished quite a bit. And then the boathouses, of course, were right down on the water, where the DNR would never allow you to build a boathouse today. So I think I've got another page of Adirondacks in here. And so this is they were doing panoramic photography after a while. That's that's also early 1900s stuff, and that's one whole resort. This is the grocery store. It's also called the garden these days, but they did their own vegetables and everything. In the summer, there weren't grocery stores that you could go and feed all of the guests that they would have in there. So everything was done on site. Even though they had a lake here, they had a well because there's a windmill up there. So that means they were pumping water in that case. This is regatta day at one of these things. I don't know if you can see very well in this picture, but it's just packed with people. There was a thirst on the part of people for these kind of communal, to see something interesting going on. So if people were going to be running a race on that day, people came out in droves to see it. Some more colorized Detroit photographic images. This is, they called it the carrying place back there instead of a portage. And you know, so there you got a guy with a necktie and his shirt, and he's out carrying a canoe from one of the Adirondack lakes to another. And maybe I've got one more, I'm not even sure. Yep, and just some of the other Detroit photographic. The impression that these sorts of things had to be able to make. I mean, it was one thing. Currier and Ives could make things idyllic, and you kind of knew that they were making them idyllic, that was the best version of what was going on. But actual photographs carried a whole different weight because they were literal translations of what you could go and see. And so that, I have to say, is the beginning of tourism on the chain, and in fact pretty much around America.